Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of the most complicated card games out there, and I get a lot of comments from you guys in the comment section and on Twitter and on Facebook asking me about specific ruling questions. That's perfectly fine, and I like making these ruling videos, and in the past I've spent entire videos talking about things like face-down banished cards and MST negating or not negating cards, but in today's video I want to talk about some Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that I feel everyone has accidentally cheated with one time or another. By learning these rulings, you can hopefully take that knowledge and apply them to other scenarios. And I do want to mention that my friend MST.TV, Tombox actually, he did a video last week talking about some more modern cards that are sort of along the same vein. I highly suggest checking out his video if you want to learn about some cards that are seeing play at tournaments right now. I think there's only one card that overlaps in our two lists, and that's going to be Pot of Extravagance. But overall, if you want to hear more modern cards, definitely check out that video. I'll put a link in the description. He's a great player, a great judge, and he knows his stuff really well. I should also mention that this video will not cover rulings like does Mystical Space Typhoon negate. Not only did I just do a video on that, but also it's a little bit too surface level for this particular discussion. I want to focus on rulings for the most part that are confusing to people that don't understand game mechanics or problem-solving card text, and there'll be a couple examples of people not reading the card as well. First off, let's talk about Mind Crush, which is a card that I'm very, very fond of. I actually made an entire video talking about this card. I think it's very skill intensive. I think it teaches a lot of rulings to players that are confused about certain things, but the part where a lot of people cheat using Mind Crush is that they don't realize that you have to have at least one card in your hand to use its effect. Even if you know the card that you're calling is in your opponent's hand, maybe they just searched it, you still have to have that one card. This is an excellent example of a ruling that can be applied to almost every single card in the game outside of the danger monsters, which have their own weird set of rulings, but in almost every single case of all cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can't attempt to activate an effect unless you can already resolve the effect. In the case of Mind Crush, because part of the effect could be sending a card from your hand to the graveyard, this means you can't activate the card unless you can resolve that part of it, which means you have to have a card in your hand. Other examples of this include cards like Lumina and Zombie Master, requiring you to already have a Lightsworn or Zombie in your graveyard to activate their effects in the first place. Even though in those monsters' cases you target the monster after you discard, you still have to have a target in the graveyard already when you use their effects for the first time. This particular ruling can be applied to many more cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And actually pretty much applies to every card except the danger monsters. The danger monsters in many ways break many of the rulings that most people have come to know, so I won't spend too much time talking about those in today's video, but just know in most cases for the cards that you're using, you can't attempt to activate effects that you can't initially resolve. Next up, there are a ton of cards in this game that miss timing, and that is one of the most frequently asked questions on my channel. Now, I personally have not done a video on mistiming. A few other channels have. It's a very widely discussed topic, and yet that is probably where the most players get confused. And where this happens is on cards like Dupe Frog or the Gustos or even Light Pulsar Dragon. These are all cards that in their effects say when, and then they say part of the effect, and then they say you can. This is the specific effect that you have to have for a card to miss timing. It can't be an if you can, it can't be a when and then not you can. It has to be a when you can effect, and this is when effects miss timing. Now, what does miss timing mean? Well, it means that for those effects to activate, they have to be the last chain link in the chain that's resolving. What this means is that it has to be the last thing to happen, and that's a big deal in the cases of cards like Dupe Frog and Gustos and Light Pulsar Dragon, because it means if you use them for tribute summons or extra deck summons, you don't actually get to trigger their effects because the last thing to happen was the monster being summoned, not the card being sent to the graveyard. And while there's a lot more that I could talk about with missing the timing, I think it's way too complicated to just fit inside of this one video alongside other rulings. Just for the most part, know if a card has an optional when you can effect, you can't do it if you use that monster for a tribute summon or extra deck summon. There are a variety of other situations where you can actually force cards to miss timing in order to gain an advantage against your opponent, but overall, if you're starting out Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're confused about missing the timing, just realize that when you use those types of monsters for extra deck summons, you don't get their effects. Here's one that I didn't know when I first started using the card. You can't use Cyframe Lord Omega immediately when your opponent's main phase starts. You see, in every single phase, the turn player gets the opportunity to do the first action. So in the case of a card like Cyframe Lord Omega, your opponent gets a chance to summon a monster, or set a back row, or activate a spell card before you get a chance to use its effect. This matters a lot because if your opponent has a Kaiju monster, they can immediately Kaiju your Omega as the first action in main phase 1, and then you can't use the Omega at all. This doesn't come up too often and only really comes up, as far as I'm concerned, with Cyframe Lord Omega, but it's a pretty big difference maker for that card because that means that whatever the best card in their hand is, they can just set it or summon it immediately and you don't get a chance to rip it out of their hand. Just know that whenever you enter a phase, the turn player gets the first chance to do anything before the non-turn player gets a chance to respond to something. Now I want to focus the shift of this video a little bit into cards that people misread or misunderstand the first time that they go through them. These are cards that see popular play in competitive events, but also cards that people sometimes screw up and you don't want to let yourself get cheated. The first one that I'm talking about is Evenly Matched. Now, where are people screwing up in Evenly Matched? Well, a lot of people forget, more people than you might think, that you have to control no cards on the field to use an Evenly Matched from your hand right away. I think this comes up because Red Reboot is the card that is played against similar decks. They're both played against back row strategies, but in the case of Red Reboot, you're allowed to have cards on the field. That's what makes a card so powerful. But in the case of Evenly Match, if you have a field spell up, or if you have one back row up, you can't use it from your hand. Now, it is worth mentioning, and a lot of people forget this as well, and I don't know why, because it's not that crazy, but Evenly Match can be set when you have other cards on the field, and you can activate it if it's already set while you have other things. It won't be as effective. Your opponent will get to keep more cards than just one, like in the normal case, but it's still worth mentioning that if you already have like a field spell up, you can set an Evenly Match, and if your opponent has 8 cards, well, you can still flip the Evenly Match at the end of the battle phase, and they have to go down to 2, which is better than just keep it in your hand and not doing anything. Just make sure to quickly double check every time someone activates Evenly Match from their hand that there are no other cards on their side of the field. A lot of people forget about the field spell because it's kind of put off to the side, but definitely just look at the field and do a double check just to confirm that they can use the Evenly Match in the first place. And then there's Pot of Extravagance, which despite the fact that I keep bringing the card up, it seems like no matter how many times I read the effect on camera or in a video, someone misses some part of its restriction. So there are a lot of restrictions on this card that people seem to forget about. It has to be the very first card you activate in your main phase 1, which is a pretty big deal. Once again, a lot of people forget about that because they think, well, you can just like duality into Extravagance and then activate the Extravagance. That's broken. No, you can't. It's the same thing as Cold Wave, which I'm sure many of the people watching this video never got a chance to play with, but Cold Wave was a card that you had to use at the very start of your main phase. So that is a huge deal when you're thinking of playing Extravagance. If you have any other cards in your hand, it has to be the very first one you activate. Even if you set the card first and then flip it, you can't do that because your first action wasn't activating the Extravagance, it was setting the Extravagance. Now you miss the activation window for that card. So definitely keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that you can't draw any cards for the rest of the turn. You can add cards, that's perfectly fine, but you can't draw any other cards. This matters because I've seen people say time and time again, well, Extravagance is really good in True Dracos. Extravagance is really good in Monarchs. And I don't know if people just aren't realizing what the Extravagance restriction is, because it's bad in those decks for 2 reasons. First off, it's bad in decks like True Draco because they have like 6 other cards that draw things. You want to activate Disciples, you want to activate Heritage, you want to activate these cards to actually draw things during your turn. So if you activate Extravagance, now you just turn off like half your deck. You can't even card a Demise the same turn that you use Extravagance. The other issue is that because decks like those already have so many forms of draw power, if you draw into the Extravagance, it's just a dead card in your hand that you can't use because it's no longer the start of your main phase. I think a lot of people forget about these things when they're thinking of Extravagance, and I also think people forget about that the banishing 3 or 6 is a cost. The reason this matters is because if your opponent activates Extravagance and you have an Ash Blossom in your hand, please wait until your opponent banishes the 6 cards from their extra deck before you use the Ash Blossom. If you don't wait, what your opponent can do is just banish 3 and say, oh, I was only using it as an Upstart Goblin. At that point, you've already Ash Blossomed because you did it way too early, and now you didn't get to banish 6 cards out of the extra deck, they only banished 3 cards. That's a pretty big deal when you're thinking of Now, if they have 2 more extravagances in later turns, they can get the full value, the full draw 2 out of those ones, and you sort of wasted your Ash Blossom on just an upstart goblin, essentially. Anyway, though, that's pretty much gonna wrap up today's video on several rulings that I feel people sort of accidentally cheat on. Maybe in some cases people are maliciously doing these things, but I like to sort of expect the best out of players. I want to think that people aren't trying to cheat. I know in every single game out there, you're gonna have cheaters, and that sucks, and hopefully they get punished by judges or their opponents call them out on things like this. But I think most people are just good players that are trying to play clean, and I think that's great. So hopefully if you were doing any of these things by accident, or if your opponents were doing these things, now you know for future reference that these things are not legal plays. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.